Michele O'Neil, welcome to the program.
Thanks, David.
Look, just on this point, the ACTU did agree to these flexibility arrangements back in March and early April, right, when this crisis began. Given that a lot of businesses still can't reopen, still certainly aren't back to where they were, do you think it's a good idea to snap back to the old workplace rules just yet?
Look, I think we want to see what the government's going to announce this week. We're really concerned that JobKeeper can't end in September. It needs to continue. We all know we're not through this crisis. Working people need to stay connected to their jobs. And we were calling for a wage subsidy, if you remember, way back at the beginning of this pandemic. We were pleased to see JobKeeper introduced, but it, of course, has had gaps in it, which have left many workers falling out of the system. We want to see them covered and we want to see it extended. We think it makes sense that you check whether the companies are still in distress. So that notion that rather than just looking at what companies were doing in March, that we should have a regular, we reckon quarterly check about whether their revenue is still dropped to make them eligible. But other than that, we really want to make sure that this program extends at least for 6 months. As far as the provisions in the Fair Work Act, we will look at what the government announces. If people get JobKeeper, we can see that there's aspects of that we'll consider. But in relation to people that are not going to get JobKeeper, we see no basis or justification for that change at all.
Well, just to be clear on that, do you accept, we'll see what the government does this week with JobKeeper or whatever follows JobKeeper and what the payment level will be. But there are plenty of businesses, do you accept, that simply can't put their staff back on the hours they had them on before the pandemic?
So there's two things to say. If they are still in that sort of distress, then of course JobKeeper should continue. And there's elements of the program that were put in place in terms of the Fair Work Act that if JobKeeper's in place, we could see the way to extend that.
Or something like JobKeeper, just to be clear. Exactly. It doesn't have to be $1,500 a fortnight.
Well, I'm not going to commit to something that we've not seen. So we think the level is right. But we will look at what the government announces and discuss what's needed to make sure that those workers get JobKeeper, that they're subsidised and they stay connected to their jobs.
So if they get that, the flexibility arrangements, you're okay with them continuing for those businesses?
For people that are getting JobKeeper and for that period of time, a time-limited period while they're getting that JobKeeper support.
Do you also accept there are probably plenty of workers out there right now? We're in the middle of a recession, worried about their jobs. Who would rather have a part-time job with fewer hours than no job at all?
Of course I do, but that's what's happening, and it was happening pre any changes to the Fair Work Act. So we've actually got an extraordinarily good system in terms of a combination of protection for workers as well as flexibility that exists in our Fair Work Act well before the changes to do with JobKeeper. It also exists in many awards and many agreements, and there's a real willingness by working people to work with the people that they work for, their employers, to find a way through this. But we don't need and can't see a justification for changes that reduce people's hours and consequently their pay without agreement in businesses that are not still suffering.
So if a business can stand on its own feet without JobKeeper, it should go back to the conditions that applied pre-pandemic.
That's right, and what we know is that, for example, there's opportunities already within those pre-pandemic conditions for workers and employers to discuss how do you avoid redundancies, and they are in place and have been in place and they're useful.
Let's turn to the plan you're announcing today. You're releasing today the National Jobs Plan from the ACTU. There are 5 main ideas you're putting forward. The first is permanently free childcare. Now, you say this would cost about $7 billion a year, and then on top of that, an unspecified amount for subsidising the wages of childcare workers. Just to explain that, you think all parents, regardless of income, should have access to free childcare?
We do. We think it's an important measure that we have in place in Australia free, universal, accessible childcare, and that we give support to the public childcare sector. And this is important because early childhood education and care is essential for children because we know those early years is when your brain develops, it's when it's most important that you get good quality education and care. But it's also really important for workers, particularly women workers, who still do the primary caring for our children. And in Australia, the participation of women in the labour market when you're in the ages of 25 to 45 is actually less than many other comparable countries in the world. And if we got them them, if we got women to participate at the same rate in those ages as men, that would add $70 billion to our economy, would add $30 billion to wages. So it's smart for workers, gives women the real opportunity to return properly to work, and of course it's really good for our kids.
Even Labor, though, has balked at making childcare free for people on high incomes. Have you had any discussion with Labor about this? Would you be urging them to take this on as a new policy position?
Look, we want to discuss this with all political parties. Of course we want to discuss this with Labor, with the government and also any other political parties as well, because we think it makes sense. We're putting forward these 5 ideas as part of a National Reconstruction for the Economy plan. These are 5 pragmatic proposals that will go towards that. But what's really needed is for the government to realise that there needs to be a jobs-led reconstruction. And this is not the first time in our history where such an ambitious plan has been needed. We saw it after World War II, where in fact when the war was still in place, we saw the Curtin government step up, put in place a national reconstruction plan. Well, similar thing is needed now.
Let's look at some of the other ideas then. On skills, you've suggested ongoing wage subsidies for apprentices and a nationwide free TAFE program for priority courses. Is this basically an enhanced version of what the Prime Minister announced during the week with his job trainer
Look,
plan?
it's different in some key ways. We welcome there was a commitment there, but what we know, of course, is this government has taken $3 billion out of vocational education and training over its life, so seeing about 2/3 go back is good. But where ours is different is this. We say that there should be 150,000 free TAFE places across the country. This is really important that it's localised, that it deals with the type of courses and training that's needed in communities that will lead to jobs. And the government's plan doesn't specify TAFE. So we don't want to see money going into the pockets of dodgy private providers. We already know that the system in terms of vocational education and training has been plagued with that. So TAFE is at the centre of our plan and public money for public good. The other bit of it, David, is about the apprenticeships. So the government plan only subsidises apprenticeships through to March next year. Our plan is saying you need to provide that 50% wage subsidy for the life of the apprenticeship or traineeship and guarantee a job at the end. That's the big difference.
You're also calling for a new manufacturing strategy, essentially involving the greater use of Australian content in all government procurement. Is this essentially a more protectionist approach for Australia?
No, it's recognising a few things. It's recognising that if we want to ensure that we deal with the challenges, for example, of climate change, then we need to assist and develop our manufacturing industry in a way where they can adjust to less energy-intensive forms of power. And we need to make sure that they have the capacity to adapt to renewable energy. We need to also make sure that we're making the type of products here in Australia that are good for Australia and can be exported, higher tech products, and again dealing with what the reality of the needs of our country and others for the future. The government procurement is a really powerful tool to get this going because the government does spend a lot of money, but it also provides an opportunity to assist in the innovation, the development, the research. So no,
sure,
it's not...
But if you're mandating more Australian content, I think you're suggesting 75% Australian content, would that cost more for all these infrastructure projects that we're talking about here?
Well, it's about how you look at cost, isn't it? Because if you see the benefit of developing and supporting manufacturing jobs and the role of innovation and manufacturing in our country in the long term, then there may be a short-term cost in terms of the immediate infrastructure, but the flow-on effect in terms of the jobs you create, the quality of those jobs, the security of them, and the type of manufacturing sector we develop, that means we're ready for the next crisis as well. Because, I mean, you know my history, the notion that we did not have here in Australia the right sort of personal protective equipment and gear available was a shocking thing to many Australians. So we need to think about both being ready to have what we need here in terms of sovereign capacity, but as well as making sure we're ready to export strongly.
Can I just turn to some of the things that aren't in your plan? Tax. Where does the union movement stand on tax cuts and bringing forward the next round of already legislated personal income tax cuts?
Look, we don't think this is what's needed at this moment.
Why not?
Because, well, a couple of things. One is that what's needed is for the government to have an ambitious, big, bold, comprehensive National Reconstruction Plan. And that costs money. And it costs money for good reason, because government needs to lead this. We can't sit back and think the economy or the private sector is going to do this on their own. They're severely damaged. People are anxious. Businesses are worried. The government must lead this.
People are anxious, but a tax cut would put, we're talking about the second round here, would put an extra $1,000 in the pocket of someone earning 70 grand a year.
It's going to put nothing in the pocket if you haven't got a job. It's going to put nothing in your pocket if your hours are so low that you don't even hit that threshold. 30% of those tax cuts go to people earning more than $200,000. So we don't see that it makes sense at this moment in a pandemic to bring them forward.
Well, Labor support's bringing them forward, the second round of tax cuts, so they've got that wrong as well?
We've got a different opinion, and we've got a strongly held different opinion. We think this is not the time to look at reducing the money that government has to spend. This is a time that people want to see public dollars used for public good. It's going to help us get through a crisis. We're in a huge economic crisis as well as a health one. This is the time where government should say the money that taxpayers pay, we want to make sure gets used in a way that's going to support jobs and support people.
You don't say much in the plan about industrial relations, and I know that those talks are ongoing with the government in the 5 working groups about where you can find consensus. Can I just check though, does the union still want industry-wide bargaining in Australia?
Look, we think it makes sense to be able to have bargaining available for everyone. So if you look at how bargaining happens... Well, yes, because take, for example, the workers who work in the community sector, many women workers who work in small community organisations, non-government bodies, there's no capacity for them to be able to effectively bargain. They're locked out of the bargaining sector at the moment because they can't have at the table the people who really control the money, which is often government. So if you're going to effectively bargain to make sure that everyone has an opportunity, you have to look at sector bargaining as part of that.
Final one, Parliament being cancelled for 2 weeks. What do you think of that?
Look, we've always supported that it's important to follow the very best health advice. So I'm never going to criticise a government for following health advice. We're asking every worker to do it. But what I know is that workers have been making adaptation to change how we work. We're working virtually. We're working in ways that people have never worked before. I don't see why government can't do it. Why can't we have the Parliament operate in a way where people can stay where they are and still be able to debate and discuss and make decisions? It should happen on Zoom. It should happen virtually. The other thing, David, is we've got this big decision about JobKeeper and JobSeeker coming out this week. So we're concerned that it'll be a full month before there's any scrutiny or debate about what that means for working people. Workers want to see certainty. We need to know that JobKeeper is going to continue. We need to see JobSeeker also continue at that higher rate. We want this debated and these decisions made.
Michele O'Neil, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.
All right, back to the panel in a moment. First, here was the Prime Minister foreshadowing what's to come in this week's announcement about JobSeeker and JobKeeper.
I've been